Hi there, welcome back to part 3 of our video tutorial on the poem The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. This will be our third and final video on the poem. So we left off last lesson finishing stanza 2. Today's lesson we're going to look at stanzas 3, 4 and 5 before you go off and complete independent tasks on the poem. Let's carry straight on. We're going to go straight back to our close reading and back to stanza 3. So I'm going to go straight into the close reading for stanza 3. So there's a real melody to stanza 3 and to the rest of the poem as well, but I particularly think the melody is more obvious in this stanza. You have the repetition of the word I, which I'm sure we noticed as we were reading. It's repeated 1, 2, 3, 4 times, this first person voice that's really authoritative and clear. And I think, again, we've talked a couple of times in previous lessons about how in this poem, I don't think this is Hughes's voice. I think he's writing as an embodiment of the African soul or the people of the African Caribbeans. So the first line we'll look at in detail, we'll go line by line. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. Okay, I'll remind you of the Euphrates quickly. Okay, so we talked in previous lessons about how the Euphrates is a river that runs through countries like Iran and Iraq, and it is associated with this area, this region known as the Fertile Crescent, and this is where the first civilizations, the first human civilizations, sprung from, such as, like I said before, the ancient Sumerians, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all come from the rich soil that is formed by the river. So this image of bathing in the Euphrates when dawns were young, I think, again, it's metaphorical more than anything. It describes the process of, I suppose, I think it emphasizes the idea that the African people have had a civilization for as long as civilizations have existed. I think it's really a point or a line of poetry that emphasizes the ancient origins of the African people. That they were bathing in the Euphrates when the dawns were young. The dawns were young, I think, that use of pathetic fallacy there, that the image of the dawn is an example of metaphor in a sense as well, because I think it's the dawn of civilization is what I think of, the earliest stage of humanity, its very beginnings. I think the word bathed is really powerful in this sentence. It reminds me of the kind of ritual in India of people bathing in the river Ganges, and it's in India it's seen as a kind of a holy rite, a sacred rite of passage to at least once in a life bathe in the Ganges, the river of your ancestors. And I think here really that Euphrates River serves as a symbol for human civilization and our origins, our shared origins, the Euphrates River being the beginning of time. And there's lots of emphasis and I think lots of references to new beginnings. I think you could read the word bathed as being kind of a biblical word, and the idea of being immersed in water is part of the process of being baptized. So I think even that word has an association with new beginnings. Obviously the Euphrates and the dawn of civilization, and of course that word dawn, the process of a new day, and of course youth, and the word young itself, the idea of a new beginning. So all of these words in some ways, they're part of what we call a lexical field, which I'll briefly explain. It's when words belong to a kind of similar family of words, and they all kind of are interrelated. So all of these words, I think, emphasize the idea of an origin, of the source, of the spring. I'll support that argument further by just referring to that it's the first river that's been referred to in the poem. So it's in a sense it's the source of the other rivers that will flow throughout the poem. It's the beginning. It's the root of the poem. The next line, I built my hut near the Congo. I'll show you the river Congo and then we'll look over this line as well. Okay, so the next line, it goes, I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. And on your screens you have that image of the river Congo, and we talked about how it's the river that flows through the heart of Africa, really. It goes from the center of Africa out to the Atlantic. And it is associated, I think it's the first example really in the poem where we have a river that is associated to some extent with the exploitation of Africans, because you have that link with the Congo to the Atlantic, and of course the transatlantic slave trade. But also, like I said in the last lesson, the first lesson, the exploitation of Africa by the imperialist powers, and how they would, the steamboats would travel down the River Congo. But it's an interesting parallel, this line, compared to the first one. So we have this idea of bathing initially. Now it's building. So it's almost as if it's mirroring, as as the poem flows on. The I becomes more developed. So the I who built the hut, that's a more developed stage of humanity, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. This idea that he's mirroring maybe the progression of civilization and of human beings and their advancements. So he's obviously the hut image, I think, harkens back to kind of tribal groups, and it again harkens back to the origins of humanity and the idea of the simplicity of life and the hardship and difficulty of life in Africa before the movement of people from Africa out to other places. I think in this line, the Congo is personified. In fact, most of these rivers are in some way personified throughout. And I think certainly the Congo is personified in a maternal way. You'll notice that the next clause in that sentence is, and it lulled me to sleep. So, and of course, this idea of being lulled to sleep by the river is a really gentle image, one that's really reassuring, and I think one that's really kind of almost romantic and idyllic in a sense, being lulled to sleep by the sound of the river rolling past the hut. But I certainly think it's an example of personification as well, because it's the kind of acts that you'd expect a mother figure to do. So I think the Congo is turned into this maternal figure that has raised and nourished and comforted the people of the African American people as well. This idea that and later we'll talk about the huge distance between the rivers referred to now and of course the Mississippi. So I do think there's a kind of implicit idea that's referred to here, which is being separated from your mother figure, and the separation of I think that mirrors the separation of the Africans from their continents as part of the slave trade. So I do think in this line, to be clear, there is a kind of romanticization of Africa as being the mother figure, as being a maternal figure that has the power to comfort the speaker, but I also think it's the first subtle reference to slavery. Okay, the next line is far more explicit in its relationship to slavery and to the themes of hardship and suffering experienced by the African American. The next line is, I looked upon the river Nile and raised the pyramids with it. So I'll show you. So again, the Nile, like the Euphrates, there's this kind of association with, with worship and the idea of the sacred river. The ancient Egyptians were particularly reverent towards the river Nile, as they knew that it both was the provider and also the destroyer. It would provide them with crops that they could harvest, but it provided fertile soil, but it also could destroy easily through flooding. So this next line, I looked upon the Nile and I raised the pyramids above it. I would say this is a more explicit reference to slavery, and in particular to the 1,000 years of slavery spent by the Israelites in Egypt before Moses led them to the promised land. So I think it's very much a reference to slavery here and to the suffering of a people. And I think what's going on here, in my opinion, is that Hughes is recognizing the parallels and the similarities between the suffering inflicted by the Israelites in Egypt under the pharaohs as slaves with the African Americans who have suffered on the Mississippi, and this idea that, again, I think it's a glimmer of hope, I would argue, because the Israelites eventually found the promised land. They eventually have a homeland, and I think the idea here is Hughes is implicitly suggesting that the African Americans will have a homeland in the future. I think that comes in at the end of the stanza, perhaps. So it's an interesting line. He's looking upon the Nile, the voice again, and then this idea that in a sort of godlike way, he manages through the looking to raise pyramids above the Nile. It gives this suggestion of power and and of authority to the people, to the speaker. The fact that they can, by looking at something, they can raise a structure. It's also perhaps a reference to the 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 idea that black historical figures are often, because of slavery predominantly, black people are seen as being relatively weak, I suppose, compared to the white Europeans. If you look at it, if you look at history, and perhaps he's referring to the power here of the pharaohs, who I suppose could summon a pyramid to be raised, because they were treated as gods on earth. That's one possible interpretation. I do think the reference to the pyramids, the words pyramids, is very much symbolic here, because there's this. It's actually a misunderstanding. It's actually a bit of a myth, but there is this idea that the slaves constructed the pyramids. The Israelite slaves constructed the pyramids. So I do think that what Langston Hughes is doing here is he's kind of associating rivers with hugely important aspect of the African experience. And I think the recognition of the suffering of the Israelites. We listened in the first lesson to the spiritual "Go Down Moses," which is obviously inspired by the suffering that the Israelites experienced in Egypt. And I think there's a really strong association between slave spirituals and the suffering of the Israelites in the Bible, which kind of gives them hope that one day they too will be, they will escape the suffering that they've experienced and find their promised homeland. Okay, so that's river number 3, the Nile. The next line is hugely important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually have a checkpoint now, and then we'll come back to the latter half of the stanza. Welcome back. In the final 3 lines of the poem, we have what I would describe as a kind of temporal shift, which means a shift forward, in this case, in time. Because I think we go from ancient history, we go from the ancient civilizations of Mesopotamia. We go from Africa and its ancient historical civilizations. We go from the ancient civilizations associated with the Nile to a more modern history, one that's actually 1921 feels almost incredibly recent. The emancipation of the slaves and the idea that America in the South, the economy was reliant on this, on slavery and on the commodification of human beings. The idea of human chattel, the idea of a human being a good that can be bought and sold. And it's an incredibly painful memory that is still alive. There were people who, in 1921 who would themselves have been and experienced the horrors of slavery, and even experienced the horrors of the passage across the middle passage, the passage of the journey from Africa to the New World, to America and to the Caribbean. So let's have a look at the picture of the Mississippi, and I'll read out those lines and try and explain them as carefully as possible. Okay, here's the Mississippi River, and of course the Mississippi is associated with the deep South, with the with the region of America that really was dependent on slavery, especially on the plantations where slaves were used to pick cotton and complete menial and laborious labor tasks for the benefit of the wealthy plantation owners. And so the line begins. We'll look at the first. We'll look at the kind of all 3 lines in one go, because it's actually just one sentence. So it starts, "I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turned all golden in the sunset." It is a glorious line of poetry. It is stunning. I just think there's so much to talk about here. I love the beginning and that refrain, I. I think it really gives it a melody, this poem. It gives it a meter and a rhythm. And here it's that I heard the singing. And it's kind of vague about what he's describing here. Is he describing the singing of slaves who had been taken on ships down the Mississippi River to the plantations? And is he talking about the spirituals he would have heard? Like songs like Wade in the Water, songs like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, songs like Amazing Grace, those wonderful hymns that that people that descend from the slaves, descend from those songs of suffering and hardship. Is he talking about those spirituals that were sung on the Mississippi River, songs of agony, songs of suffering, songs of hope? Or is he talking about the singing sound of the river itself? It's a beautiful line, the singing of the Mississippi. I think you could argue that the river itself is personified. But he's certainly placing himself in a historical moment because he refers to this man, Abraham Lincoln. So this is Abe Lincoln, and I'm sure some of you recognize him. He's famous for many reasons, but he's obviously one of the great American presidents. There's now a memorial called the Lincoln Memorial that's dedicated to him. That dominates kind of the view in Washington D.C. He's the 16th president of the United States. He served from 1861 to 65, and importantly, he served during the Civil War. He was on the side of the Northern Union side that was trying to keep the states together, as opposed to the Confederacy, and he was trying again to the person who granted that's being, not being fair to Lincoln. He's a very important historical figure, but that's the general overview. So you might have noticed that he's not called Abraham Lincoln in this line. He's called Abe Lincoln, and I think that Abe is a kind of, I would say it's a diminutive, so it's been shortened to show affection. I think it's an affectionate nickname, Abe Lincoln. The fact that the speaker clearly thinks fondly of this great man who fought for the right cause and fought and led to end this atrocity, this stain on humanity that was the transatlantic slave trade. So that's the first thing to explain. So he said, I've heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans. And he places himself in this event which is based on a true event, which is when Lincoln traveled down to New Orleans, which is a city in the South, and he witnesses this, which I'll show you on the screen. So Lincoln is famous for harboring a lifelong loathing of slavery, and he'd actually experienced it. I mean, not obviously he's not been a slave, but he'd witnessed it firsthand. He'd witnessed the horrors of the slave trade when in the 1830s, at the beginning of the decade, he traveled down the Mississippi to New Orleans and witnessed the scene that you're watching, which is a human slave market. This is where newly arrived human slaves, who again were treated as goods that could be bought and sold, were put on auction and sold to the highest bidder. And obviously it's obviously incredibly dehumanizing and degrading and heinous. But it's also a tragic event often because you can see here mothers often get torn away from their babies and never see each other again. Husbands get torn away from their wives and children. It's a horrific event, a horrific, like I said before, a stain on humanity that this kind of thing took place. And the reference to New Orleans in the poem is a reference to a slave market, like you can see on your screens. And I suppose it's a symbol of horror, a symbol of dehumanization, a symbol of the degradation of the black people. And think about, earlier in the same stanza, how he speaks with pride about raising the pyramids, or how he speaks with pride about the connections to these great rivers, these great civilizations. And now the symbolism has changed somewhat, and the African Americans are rendered into goods that can be bought and sold and exchanged and sold to the highest bidder. But the stanza ends on what I consider to be a fairly optimistic note. There's a comma and you have this clause, and I'll go back to showing you the picture of the Mississippi first. So we have I like a positive note with this description of the Mississippi. He says, I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. And again, there's this recurring idea of the personification of the rivers. So far we've had the Congo lulling him to sleep, the Nile raising pyramids, this Mississippi singing, and now we've got this idea of its bosom. Again, it's the idea of it being a human body. And just look at the colours. The muddy, I don't think is a derogatory term. I think it's about it's a description of the colour of the Mississippi itself, and the fact that it's brown is part of its beauty. So I think it's almost a celebration of the color brown, a celebration of blackness. Again, a celebration of the fact that despite the the climate in 1921 and the amount of racism that was systemic in America, there's still this pride in Langston Hughes's work, this celebration of his blackness, of his color, of his people. So its muddy bosom turns golden, and it's a beautiful image of the light imagery of the sun, of course, reflecting off the surface of the river, but also that golden, especially in America, has that association with the American dream, with the idea that America ought to be a land of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, according to the Declaration of Independence. And I think that's what that golden color for me in that color imagery represents. This it harkens back to the founding fathers who intended to build a society where all men were created equal with inalienable rights. And there's a great irony in America that those rights were not extended to the African Americans. So I think what he's referring to is this idea that Americans of all colors and all creeds should be able to follow the American dream, particularly black African Americans. And then it's an interesting ending. It says, "I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset." And of course, I hope you notice the cyclical nature of this stanza. It begins with the dawn, it ends at sunrise. So there's a cyclical nature to the poem. It mirrors the full day, the sun passing from the east to the west. And cleverly, I think the rivers themselves flow from east to west. So we have Euphrates, the Nile, the Congo, and then we end up in the west, in the New World, in the Mississippi. So I think there's lots of movement images and lots of references to movement throughout the poem. We've had the blood as well flowing through human veins. So consider how many times movement is referred to, and think about how that links to the idea of the African diaspora, the idea of the movement of people out of Africa, either being uprooted and forcibly moved out of Africa, or moving out of Africa in other ways. So it's a kind of description of a culture and of a people, isn't it, really? And then we have the full stop, and I think there's a finality to that. And we'll come back to the refrain, "I've known rivers," in the next part of the poem. But for now, let's have a checkpoint. Okay, so your checkpoint questions are now on the screen. Again, follow the timings I've suggested, but if you need more time, then feel free to take it. And I'll see you shortly. So please pause the video. So we move to stanza 4 and 5, and I'll combine these two stanzas probably. I've known rivers, ancient dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. So we've got I would say a repetition of a refrain. A refrain is more, you kind of hear that in a kind of connotations of music usually, or a kind of a chorus being repeated. So we have this repetition of what we've heard already. I've known rivers. And again, it's almost this sound of the wisdom of the speaker. The sound, he's kind of summing up the experience of the African people that he's detailed in the poem. I've known rivers, and this time they're ancient and dusky rivers. And again, in terms of, I think it's almost more of a song, more of a spiritual than a poem sometimes, because I think it's about this repetition of words that are particularly important. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. These adjectives, again, emphasizing, the word ancient, obviously emphasizing the fact that, the African experience, or the experience of African Americans in terms of their roots, goes all the way back to the dawn of time. I think that's my interpretation of that word ancient. Again, about the lineage or the roots of the people. The dusk, I think, is another reference similar to the description of the muddy river. Another reference to darkness, but again, challenging in a way our European brains, because in European literature and Western literature, darkness is so often negative. But I think in this poem, the darkness is positive. I think the dusky rivers is a positive description of the beauty of the color of the river Mississippi or the other rivers, and this idea that it's a dark color, that it's deep, that it's a symbol of the people themselves. I've known ancient dusky rivers. My soul, finally, we've got that repetition here. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. That, again, deliberate use of anaphora, that same phrase that we've talked about already in its significance. And notice how it comes at the bottom of the poem, almost like the riverbed itself. So it's kind of mirroring the actual river. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. And the soul, of course, of the African American people. The depth, the profundity, the image of the tree again coming up again. So it's a very poignant, very heartfelt and sincere ending to the poem. It gives that finality. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. That kind of sound of wisdom and experience coming through. So that marks the end of the poem and therefore the end of the lesson. You now have time to complete your independent tasks and your quiz. I hope you enjoyed this poem as much as I did. Certainly one of my favourite poems that we've covered so far. And I'll see you next time for another lesson on modernist poetry. Goodbye. Stay safe and stay well.